Something real is shifting on this battlefield. And if you've been watching this war the way serious people watch chess, you already feel it in your gut. This is not the same war it was 6 months ago. The numbers have changed, the momentum has changed, and most importantly, the economic architecture underneath this entire conflict is cracking in ways that the mainstream narrative isn't fully telling you. Ukraine has recorded its first territorial gains since 2023, with Ukrainian forces reclaiming territory in the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions, and that alone is a headline worth sitting with. Not because a few hundred square kilometers changes the map overnight, but because of what it signals about the deeper mechanics of this war. When a country that has been bleeding ground for over a year suddenly starts taking it back, something fundamental has shifted in the balance of power. And I want to walk you through exactly what that something is, because it is bigger, more consequential, and more strategically significant than most commentators are willing to say out loud. Let's start with the territorial picture itself, because context is everything here. Ukraine's commander-in-chief Syrskyi confirmed that Ukraine reclaimed 470 square kilometers of occupied territory this year, marking its first territorial gains since 2023. The Institute for the Study of War, a Washington-based think tank, has cited evidence to support the liberation of at least 334 square kilometers, noting that its conservative mapping methodology likely underestimates Ukrainian advances. Now, to the casual observer, those numbers might not sound like much, but strategically they represent something the Russian military has not wanted to confront: a reversal of momentum. And momentum in war is not just a military concept. It is a psychological, economic, and political force that reverberates through every decision-making room from the Kremlin to Washington to Brussels. What's even more telling is what happened to Russia's rate of advance. The ISW assessed the Russian rate of advance as having slowed by two-thirds over the past 18 months. Russian forces advanced at a rate of 14.9 square kilometers each day from October 2024 to March 2025, compared with 10.66 square kilometers a day from March through October of 2025, and just 5.5 square kilometers a day in the first 3 months of 2026. Read that again slowly. Russia has gone from nearly 15 square kilometers a day to 5.5. That's not a minor battlefield adjustment. That's a war machine losing torque. And when you combine that with what Ukraine has been doing to Russia's economy from the inside out, the picture gets very dark for Moscow and very interesting for anyone trying to understand where this conflict is actually heading. The ISW reported the liberation of approximately 200 square kilometers of territory previously seized by Russian forces. Among the units participating in the assault were formations that had earlier successfully cleared the Dobropilya axis in the Donetsk region, where Russian troops had achieved a breakthrough in 2025. These are not conscript units thrown at a wall hoping something sticks. These are battle-hardened formations that learned from previous operations and came back sharper, and that matters enormously because one of the quiet stories of this war has been the gradual professionalization of the Ukrainian military under extreme pressure, a military that entered this full-scale phase of the conflict with courage but limited combined arms experience and has emerged with something close to institutional battlefield intelligence. Now here's where it gets fascinating, and where I think most American commentators completely miss the forest for the trees. The territorial gains are real, but they are not the main event. The main event is happening in the economic dimension of this war, and it is devastating for Russia in ways that could prove more decisive than any single battlefield victory. Ukrainian drone attacks have knocked out about 40% of Russia's oil export capacity, disrupting shipments from major Baltic and Black Sea ports, what Reuters called the most severe oil supply disruption in modern Russian history. Think about what that means for a country whose entire war machine runs on petrodollars. Russia is not just fighting a land war in Ukraine, it is simultaneously hemorrhaging the revenue it needs to sustain that war. And Ukraine found the pressure point. Ukrainian strikes against the Ust-Luga and Primorsk oil export terminals in the Baltic Sea severed as much as 40% of Russian oil export revenue, equivalent to 2 million barrels of oil per day. These are not symbolic strikes. These are surgically calibrated economic operations dressed in military clothing. Ukraine understood something profound. You don't just fight the army, you fight the treasury. And the treasury, in Russia's case, runs through those Baltic seaports like blood through an artery. Hit the artery hard enough and long enough, and the body begins to fail, no matter how many soldiers it still has in the field. Ukrainian President Zelensky stated that Russia's oil revenue losses from long-range capabilities were estimated at no less than $2.3 billion in March alone, and Ukraine continued that campaign into April. $2.3 billion in 1 month from drone strikes. This is asymmetric warfare operating at a level of economic precision that military theorists will be writing about for decades, and it forces us to rethink entirely what power looks like in the 21st century. It's not about the size of your army anymore. It's about the intelligence of your targeting, the range of your platforms, and your willingness to strike at the systemic vulnerabilities of your adversary's economic architecture. During the first 2 months of 2026, Russia's oil and gas revenues had already plummeted by 47%, while mounting sanctions pressures and runaway defense spending were taking a heavy toll, 47%, nearly half, before the drone campaign even reached its peak intensity. And that was before Ukraine started striking refineries deep inside Russian territory, facilities in Bashkortostan, Samara, Nizhny Novgorod, places that had felt comfortably removed from the war. The Leningrad regional governor told an assembly that St. Petersburg had become a frontline region, announcing plans to recruit reservists to form mobile fire groups near industrial facilities to shoot down drones. St. Petersburg. Frontline. Those words would have seemed absurd in 2022. They don't seem absurd now. A surge in Ukrainian drone attacks on ports and refineries forced Russia to slash its oil production in April, estimated between 300,000 and 400,000 barrels per day, in what could be the sharpest monthly decline in output since the COVID-19 pandemic. According to industry sources, the April drop represented a total decline of up to 600,000 barrels per day compared to late 2025 levels. And here's the brutal irony that history will not forget. Russia had been expecting a windfall. When the United States and Israel struck Iran, oil prices shot above $100 a barrel, and Moscow was rubbing its hands together, expecting to fill its war chest just as it needed it most. Ukraine watched that happen, calculated the opportunity, and struck the export infrastructure before Russia could capitalize on it. The windfall evaporated before it arrived. Energy revenues represent approximately 25% of Russia's state budget proceeds. The current capacity loss translates to immediate fiscal pressure. At prices exceeding $100 per barrel, the disruption represents approximately $200 million in daily revenue losses, potentially reaching $73 billion annually if sustained. $73 billion annually. That's not a rounding error. That is the war budget. That is the missile budget, the drone budget, the soldier recruitment budget, the Wagner replacement budget. When you drain that pool, you drain the war itself, eventually. Not immediately, but structurally and irreversibly over time. Now, none of this means Russia is collapsing. Let's be clear about that. Russia continues to push forward in key areas in Donetsk toward the towns of Sloviansk, Liman, Siversk, and Kostiantynivka. The Kremlin still controls vast swaths of Ukrainian territory. Since February 24, 2022, Russia has gained roughly 29,000 square miles, approximately 13% of Ukraine, an area roughly equivalent to half the U.S. state of Illinois. That is a sobering fact. This is not a war Ukraine has won, but it is increasingly a war that Russia cannot win on its own terms, and that distinction is everything. Russia and Ukraine agreed to a 32-hour ceasefire for Orthodox Easter, but within hours, both sides accused each other of violations. By the morning of Orthodox Easter, Ukraine's armed forces had recorded 2,299 alleged ceasefire violations by Russia, while Russia's Ministry of Defense reported 1,971 alleged violations by Ukrainian forces. This is what peace looks like in a war where neither side has yet accepted the fundamental premise of the other's demands. And the peace talks themselves remain trapped in an impossible contradiction. Ukraine has proposed freezing the conflict along the current front lines, but Russia has rejected this, demanding that Ukraine give up all the territory in the Donetsk region that it currently controls, a demand Kiev says is unacceptable. Russia wants to codify its conquests and then some. Ukraine refuses to legitimize the theft. The gap between those two positions is not a negotiating gap. It's a chasm, and no amount of diplomatic theater covers it. What makes this moment particularly interesting from a geopolitical standpoint is the technology dimension that's quietly revolutionizing this conflict and the world beyond it. Zelensky has concluded agreements with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, with ongoing conversations with Jordan, Kuwait, Iraq, and Bahrain, offering Ukraine's drone warfare experience and layered defense systems in exchange for joint drone production support. Ukraine, a country fighting for its survival, has become a global arms technology exporter, a laboratory for the future of warfare. The Gulf states, burned by Iranian retaliation strikes they couldn't stop, came looking for what Ukraine had built, and Ukraine had exactly what they needed. Ukraine has been capable of producing at least 2,000 effective combat-proven interceptor drones every day and offered half of them to Gulf states. This is a remarkable thing. A nation under siege has become a production powerhouse in one of the most consequential military technologies of the modern era. And it raises a question worth asking. What does it mean for global power when the rules of military dominance are being rewritten by a mid-sized nation under occupation, using ingenuity, necessity, and the compressed urgency of survival? The drone revolution isn't just changing this war, it is changing what war means everywhere. Meanwhile, consider the shifting European landscape that's providing essential ballast to Ukraine's position. The European Union released a €90 billion loan to Ukraine, two-thirds of which will help Ukraine's military. The EU also announced its 20th sanctions package, designed to make it even harder for Russia to sell energy by closing loopholes in current sanctions. And perhaps most symbolically, Hungary, where pro-Russia Prime Minister Viktor Orban suffered a landslide defeat in parliamentary elections, had held up the opening of Ukraine's EU membership talks, but that obstacle has now cleared. The political winds inside Europe are not static. They are moving, and they are moving, however slowly and unevenly, away from accommodation of Russian imperial ambition. One reason behind the success of Ukrainian offensive operations has been problems within the Russian military's communications network. In January, Moscow lost access to Starlink systems after SpaceX disabled terminals used by Russian forces. These are the details that matter. Not the headline numbers, not the press releases, but the small systemic fractures that compound over time and undermine a military's ability to coordinate, communicate, and adapt. When your soldiers can't talk to their command posts, when your drones get jammed or your supply lines get hit, when your oil refineries are burning and your export terminals are offline, the cumulative effect is a war machine under metabolic stress, even if it still has pulse and momentum. Kiev-based analyst Igor Tishkovich noted that the Kremlin is deeply displeased from the morale standpoint, because their conception, their confidence that they are pushing along the entire front line is falling apart. That's the most important sentence in this entire analysis. Confidence. The Kremlin built this war on a narrative of inevitable Russian restoration, the idea that history was bending toward Moscow, that the West was fragile, that Ukraine would crack, that time was on Russia's side. That narrative is increasingly difficult to sustain when your oil ports are burning, your advance rate has dropped by two-thirds, your territories declared annexed are being reclaimed by the enemy, and your governor in Leningrad is talking about forming mobile defense units to protect refineries from drones. This war is not over. Don't let anyone tell you it is. But it has entered a new phase, one where Ukraine's strategic creativity is outpacing Russia's brute force momentum in the dimensions that will ultimately determine the outcome, not necessarily on the front lines today, but in the economic oxygen that sustains the fighting capacity of both sides. And right now, Ukraine is managing to breathe while actively restricting Russia's supply of air. That is the real story of this moment. That is what these territorial gains and drone strikes and export disruptions add up to, not a Ukrainian victory banner, but something perhaps more durable, a demonstration that Russia's war of attrition is itself being attrited.